A woman covered in blood crashes through the window of Chicago's most feared mafia boss. Armed men hunt her through the streets. Inside, Lucien Devereaux steps from the shadows with a loaded gun. And instead of pulling the trigger, he asks the one question that changes everything. But what he doesn't know yet is that saving her means declaring war on a man who built his empire on broken bodies and buried secrets. And that war is already walking through his front door. If this story grips you from the first second, hit that like button, drop your city in the comments, and let me see exactly how far this story has traveled. Now let's begin. Date. The rain came down like the city had something to confess. It hammered the asphalt on West Kinsey Street in sheets so dense the streetlights turned blurry and gold, halos bleeding into each other like something was burning underneath the pavement. It was the kind of rain that didn't invite you to stay outside. It pushed you somewhere. It made decisions for you. Bryn Calloway had already made hers 3 hours ago, and she was still paying for it. She ran, not jogged, not sprinted in some clean athletic sense. She ran the way wounded animals run, the kind of running that has nothing to do with speed and everything to do with the bone-deep refusal to stop. Her boots hit standing water and sent it exploding sideways. Her left arm pressed hard against her ribs where something had cracked during the third punch, and every inhale felt like swallowing broken glass. The cut above her eyebrow had already crusted over once and split open again from the rain, and the blood kept finding the corner of her eye no matter how many times she blinked it away. Behind her, somewhere in the churning dark between two parked delivery trucks, she could hear them, not their voices. They were past the stage of yelling. She'd outrun their words 20 minutes ago on the Riverwalk near the bridge on Franklin. What she heard now was worse. The sound of professional men doing their jobs quietly, efficiently. Shoe leather on wet pavement. The low crackling of a radio someone hadn't fully muted. The particular rhythm of people who weren't chasing her because they wanted to. People who were chasing her because they'd been paid to. And people like that didn't stop. Gavin Mercer's men never stopped. Bryn cut left down an alley between a closed laundromat and a parking structure, ducking under a fire escape so low it clipped the top of her head and sent a fresh bolt of pain down her spine. She pressed flat against the brick and forced herself to breathe through her nose, which was stupid because her nose was swollen half shut, and the blood from her eyebrow had started finding its way to her upper lip now, and everything tasted copper and salt and cold. She counted. 1, 2, 3. The radio crackle moved past the alley entrance. Slowed. Stopped. Her lungs screamed. She held them still. The crackle moved on. She gave it another 10 seconds, and then she was moving again, the only option a person has when every option has already been taken from them. The money was gone. Her apartment, the little studio on Halstead that smelled like the Thai restaurant below it, was gone because Gavin's people had been there before she even got back from the drop. Her phone was gone because she'd thrown it off the bridge on Franklin after she saw the tracking alert. The little blue dot that shouldn't have been in her screen but was, buried inside a payment app she'd used 3 weeks ago to transfer funds out of Gavin's secondary account. She hadn't planned for them to find that. She'd planned for a lot of things. She'd planned for weeks, actually. Careful, methodical, terrified planning that she did in the back booth of the bar where she worked on slow Tuesday nights when the register was quiet and the regulars had gone home. She'd gone over the numbers so many times that they lived behind her eyes when she tried to sleep. $42,000. Not a round number, not something she'd picked for convenience. $42,317 because that was the exact figure her mother's oncologist had quoted them for the experimental treatment program in Evanston, the one the insurance company had rejected twice, the one that was giving women with stage 3 ovarian cancer a 60% survival edge that standard chemo wasn't touching. Her mother had 60%. Bryn had stolen $42,000 from a man who made millions running illegal fight cards and underground betting rings, and she'd kept every single receipt. That part hadn't been sentiment. That had been self-preservation of a different kind. If the worst happened, if she ever ended up across a table from someone who wanted to know why, she needed to be able to show them, this is what I took, this is where it went, this is the bill, this is the intake form, this is the name of the woman whose life it bought. She wasn't a thief. She was a desperate person using the only currency available to her. The distinction probably wouldn't matter to Gavin Mercer. She came out of the alley onto a wider street and stopped cold. There were two of them, maybe 40 feet ahead, standing on opposite sides of the crosswalk. They weren't facing her directly. The one on the left was checking his phone. The one on the right had his collar up against the rain and was scanning parked cars. But they were positioned the way you position people when you're drawing a net tight. Bryn had grown up watching her father before he became someone she didn't talk about. Position lookouts in exactly that configuration on corners near the rail yards on the south side. She had maybe 3 seconds before the one with the phone finished whatever he was doing and looked up. She went right, not back the way she came. They'd be on her in 30 seconds if she retreated into a narrowing space. She went right and across the street at a diagonal, moving low and fast with the parked cars between her and the two men for as long as they lasted. And then the cars ran out, and she was in the open, and she committed to it because commitment was the only thing that worked when you had nothing else. And she ran flat out toward the building at the end of the block, a dark structure with music pressing through its walls like a heartbeat. She didn't know what it was. She didn't care what it was. It had light inside it and warmth and people meant witnesses, and witnesses were the only thing Gavin Mercer's men ever bothered to avoid. The front of the building was all dark glass and polished steel, a nightclub entrance with a velvet rope situation, and a man the size of a compact vehicle standing beneath a black awning. There was a line, or what had been a line before the rain turned serious, now just a handful of people clustered under umbrellas. The door was solid, recessed, the kind of entrance that communicated very clearly that it decided who came in and who didn't. Bryn didn't go for the door. She went for the window, not with any plan, not with calculation. She hit the glass because her body was still carrying the momentum of the turn off the corner, and because the man she'd left behind at Gavin's warehouse on Canal Street had thrown her into a metal shelving unit so hard that something in the way her pain signals communicated with her decision-making had simply shorted out, and in the half-second where her brain offered her the choice between the window and stopping felt like dying. The glass was thick, expensive. It gave way under her shoulder and her forearm hitting it simultaneously at an angle that had less to do with skill and everything to do with how hard desperation could make a person's body. The sound was enormous and wrong inside the quiet that existed between the music, a concussive pop followed by the shriek of a frame giving up. And then she was through it, and the world tilted 90 degrees as her feet left the ground, and she had 1 full second of weightlessness that felt almost peaceful before the hardwood floor came up and caught her with no gentleness at all. The impact took the breath completely out of her, not reduced it, removed it. She lay on the floor of whatever this place was, and her body genuinely could not find the mechanism for inhaling. Everything was black at the edges. The music had stopped. She was aware of that the way you're aware of distant facts. She registered it without it meaning anything yet. She could feel the floor against her cheek, warm, polished, solid, the sound of glass settling, the sound of chairs, the sound of very deliberate footsteps. Bryn Calloway pushed herself up onto one elbow because she would be vertical or she would be dead, and those were the only two conditions she was prepared to accept. She got her hands under her, got one knee down. The rib screamed, the eye blurred. She blinked the blood away and made herself look at the room, and what she saw was not what she'd expected any more than the floor had been soft. It was a nightclub, but not the kind she'd worked in. Not the loud, grinding, shoulder-to-shoulder kind with drink specials on chalkboards and whatever was popular on the speakers. This was something else. Dark leather booths running the perimeter, lighting so precisely controlled it felt architectural. A bar along the far wall that looked like it had been built by someone who understood that a bar is a piece of furniture first and a place to drink second. The music had been jazz, low, complex jazz that you didn't play for a crowd, you played for a room. The room had maybe 15 people in it, and every single one of them was completely still and looking at her. But it was the man who'd moved toward her that held everything. He came from somewhere near the back, from the shadow between the bar and a hallway that disappeared into the rest of the building. And he moved the way certain men move, men who have spent a long time being the most important thing in any room they occupy. Not hurried, not startled. He walked the way you walk when nothing has surprised you in years, because you've arranged the world carefully enough that surprises don't reach you. He was tall, dark jacket, no tie, collar open at the throat, Dark hair pushed back from a face that was— Bryn registered this even through the blood and the pain and the tunnel vision of physical shock. Sharp, in the specific way that comes from a life of hard decisions, leaving their marks in the right places. He wasn't young. He wasn't trying to be. He had the look of a man who had been through enough things that being alive at 38 felt like something he'd earned rather than inherited. In his right hand, brought up with the casual precision of muscle memory, was a pistol. Not pointed at her yet. Angled down, held loosely, the way professionals hold guns when they're still gathering information. He stopped 6 feet from her. Around them, in the booth closest to the window, a woman in an expensive dress had pressed herself backward against the wall. 2 men near the bar had their hands out of sight. The bartender, young, terrified, frozen, had both palms flat on the bar surface as if the bar might float away without him. Nobody moved. The man with the gun looked at her. She looked back. She was on one knee, with blood running freely down the left side of her face, her jacket torn open at the shoulder, her ribs sending white-hot signals up through her chest cavity with every breath she managed. She had nothing. No leverage, no weapon, no exit strategy. The window she'd come through was a jagged hole behind her, letting rain into a room that probably cost more per square foot than everything she'd ever owned. She waited for the question she'd been asked 100 times in various forms by various men who thought power meant you got to keep asking it. What did you take? Where is it? Do you understand who you're dealing with? The man with the gun looked at her for a long moment, and then he asked the question she had not anticipated in any of her calculations. Who did this to your face? Bryn's brain stalled. She actually couldn't process it for a second. She'd been preparing herself, in that ridiculous, automatic way the mind prepares itself even when there's nothing useful to do, for something she knew how to answer. She'd been tensing against the familiar shape of a question designed to establish that she owed something. Instead, he'd asked something entirely different, something that pointed in the opposite direction, something that assumed she was the relevant party and not the broken window or the cost of the glass or what Gavin Mercer's men wanted with her. Who did this to your face? Not who are you? Not what are you doing in my club? Not do you have any idea what you just destroyed? Who hurt you? She didn't know what to do with that. She started, and her voice came out wrong, rough and thin, the voice of someone who'd been screaming inside her own head for so long that the outside version had lost its shape. She swallowed, tried again. There are men outside, 3, maybe 4. They're going to come in here. The man's expression didn't change in any way she could measure. He looked at her for one more beat, then raised his chin in the direction of a man near the hallway. Broad-shouldered, close-cropped hair, the face of someone whose job description had never once included paperwork. Tell Marcus and Torres to move the car from the east side. A pause. And close the front. The man disappeared immediately. The pistol didn't go away, but it didn't come up either. The man with it stepped closer and crouched down to her level, which was a thing powerful men almost never did, and looked at the cut on her face with the focused attention of someone performing an assessment rather than a judgment. Can you stand? He asked. I'm already kneeling, she said. Give me a second. Take 2. She took one, on principle, and got herself upright. The room tilted. She put a hand on the nearest table edge and let it be what it was. Support, not defeat, and waited for the world to stop rotating. Sit down before you fall down, he said, and it wasn't a request, but it also wasn't cruel, just a flat acknowledgement of physics. Sit down. She sat. He turned to the bar. Get the kit from the office, Damon. The terrified bartender moved instantly, grateful for a direction. The man set his pistol on the table next to her. Not hidden, not threatening, just set aside the way you set a tool aside when you don't need it immediately, and pulled a chair around to face her. You went through a $40,000 window, he said. I'll pay for it. You'll pay for it, he repeated, and there was something in his tone that might have been the beginning of dry amusement. What's your name? Bryn? Bryn. He said it the way someone says a word they're filing for later. I'm Lucian. She knew that name. Everybody in Chicago's underground knew that name. You didn't work bars near the River North clubs without hearing the name Lucian Devereaux attached to descriptions that ranged from impressive to obscene to quietly terrifying. She'd heard it the way you hear weather reports about systems forming far offshore. Relevant information, but about something operating at a scale that didn't touch your daily life. He controlled the underground like a utility company controlled electricity. You used the lights without thinking much about what made them work. She was currently sitting in his living room, bleeding on his floor. "Lucien Devereaux," she said. "Yes." She absorbed that. "I still need to pay for the window." The corner of his mouth moved, not a smile exactly, the ghost of one, or the shape a smile leaves behind. "Yes," he said again. "You do." The bartender came back with a black case, the medical kind, not a drugstore first aid box, but the real thing, stocked like someone had thought carefully about what emergencies looked like in a place like this. Lucien opened it himself, which she hadn't expected. She'd expected him to hand it off to someone, to continue managing the situation from a supervisory distance while a subordinate dealt with the mess. Instead, he pulled his case open and took out gauze and antiseptic with the calm efficiency of a man who had done this before. "This is going to sting," he said, and then he cleaned the cut above her eyebrow without waiting for her response. She'd been right about the sting. She said nothing. His hands were steady. They weren't gentle in a performative way. He wasn't trying to be soft about it. He was just precise, moving through the process with the same focused economy he'd used walking across the room. She was aware of how close he was, how he smelled, underneath whatever he wore, like clean and something darker, cedar or smoke, or the particular scent of a man who spent time thinking in closed rooms. She was also aware that outside on the street, Gavin's men were about to make a decision. "The men outside," she said. "I know," he said. "They're not going to walk away because you closed the front door." "I know that too." "Devereaux, Lucien." He said it without looking up from the gauze. "Nobody calls me Devereaux." Outside, they heard it. Not a knock, not a request, but the kind of knock that is already a threat. The specific solid impact of someone who has been sent to communicate that the asking stage is over. Lucien replaced the cap on the antiseptic and set it aside and stood in one motion, picking up the pistol as he stood. The way you pick up your keys when you're leaving, without breaking the flow of the movement. He walked to the door, the front door, not the broken window, and opened it himself. Bryn twisted in the chair, which cost her the ribs, and watched. There were 3 of them on the other side, men she recognized, not by name, by category. The kind of men Gavin deployed for retrieval work, men whose suits fit well because Gavin believed in appearances, but who were hired for the particular skill set that had nothing to do with conversation. The one in front had a jaw like a shovel and the flat eyes of a man who'd been doing this long enough that it had flattened something essential in him. He saw Lucien, and the recognition moved through his face. The particular recognition that comes with a name, with a reputation, with understanding where you have accidentally arrived. "Sir," Jaw said, "we have no issue with you. We're here for a woman. She destroyed your property. We can cover the cost of—" "Her name is Bryn," Lucien said pleasantly. "She's having a drink." Jaw's jaw tightened. "Sir, our employer has 10 seconds to communicate to his people that they should leave this block." Lucien wasn't loud. He didn't need to be. "After that, I'll communicate to my people that Gavin Mercer's operation ends tonight. Not next week. Tonight. His accounts, his facilities, his partnerships, his protection arrangements, his agreements with the 2nd Precinct." A pause. "I know what those arrangements look like. I was the one who made sure they'd last. I can make sure they don't." Jaw stared at him. 9 seconds, Lucien said. Something happened in Jaw's face, a calculation so fast it looked almost like emotion. 8. Jaw stepped back, said something into the collar of his jacket that Bryn couldn't hear, looked at Lucien one more time with the expression of a man revising his understanding of a situation he'd walked into without enough information. Then they left. Not ran, not scrambled. But they left, and the leaving was the point, and it communicated everything it needed to communicate about where the power in this situation actually lived. Lucien came back inside and closed the door. Bryn looked at him. 7 seconds, she said. They were already moving at 6. He set the pistol down again and sat back in the chair across from her. "Now, tell me why Gavin Mercer has 3 men in the rain chasing a bartender." "I'm not just a bartender." "No," he said. "I can see that." His eyes moved over her knuckles, which were split in a pattern that no table or door had made. The split pattern of someone who punched things regularly and professionally. Underground circuit? When the money was worth it. The money from Gavin's circuit. I worked the bar and I fought when he needed a card filler. She held his gaze because looking away would have been a concession she couldn't afford. He didn't know I was doing anything else. Until he did. Until he did, she agreed. Lucian looked at her for a moment. The kind of looking that wasn't staring, wasn't intrusive, was just the careful evaluation of someone who processed information primarily through observation. What else were you doing, Bryn? She made the decision in about half a second. Not because she trusted him. She wasn't stupid enough to trust anyone in this room, in this building, on this street. But because the alternative was lying to a man who had just proved he could make 3 of Gavin's people disappear with 6 words, and lying to a man like that had a much shorter runway than she had left in her. I took money, she said, from his secondary betting accounts, through the payment system he runs on the fight nights. Lucian didn't react. How much? 42,000. She didn't flinch from the number. I have documentation of every dollar, where it came from, where it went. I wasn't taking it for myself. Where did it go? She hadn't planned on telling him this part. She hadn't planned on telling anyone this part because the moment her mother became part of this conversation, her mother became leverage, and leverage was the one thing she'd been most determined to keep out of the hands of anyone who might one day want something from her. But something about the way he'd asked, not demand, just question, the same flat directness as "who did this to your face," made her answer. My mother has cancer, she said. Stage 3. There's a treatment program in Evanston. The insurance wouldn't cover it. The money went to that. The room was very quiet. Not uncomfortable quiet, just the sound of a fact landing somewhere and settling. You kept records, he said. Every transaction. I was going to pay it back. From what? I was working on that part. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he stood up and went to the bar and poured 2 glasses of something amber. Didn't ask if she wanted one, just poured and carried both back and set one in front of her. She picked it up because her hands needed something to do, and because whatever it was smelled expensive, and she'd earned something expensive tonight. You're going to tell me everything, he said, from the beginning. How you access the accounts, how long you did it, what you know about how Gavin runs his money. And what do I get for that? Tonight, he said, you get a warm room, a doctor, and men on the door who will make sure Gavin's people don't try again before morning. And tomorrow? He picked up his own glass, looked at her over the rim with those dark, measuring eyes. We'll negotiate tomorrow when you're not bleeding on my furniture. It wasn't a promise of safety. It wasn't a guarantee of anything except the immediate arithmetic of tonight versus tomorrow. And Bryn had spent 3 weeks planning carefully, and the plan had burned to ash in the rain, and this was what was left. A mafia boss's nightclub, a broken window, and a man who had asked the one question nobody else had thought to ask. She told him. Not everything? Not yet. But enough. She told him the shape of what she'd done, the particular vulnerability she'd found in Gavin's payment routing, the way the secondary accounts settled on a 48-hour delay that created a window for electronic misdirection. She told him about the treatment program, about the oncologist's face when she'd said 60%, about her mother's name, Sharon, which felt like handing something breakable to someone she'd just met and hoping they didn't immediately drop it. Lucian listened the way careful people listen, without expression, without the impatient fidgeting that meant someone was waiting for their turn to speak. He asked specific questions, not about her, not about her mother, but about the accounts, the routing numbers, the settlement timing, whether she'd used a single device. She answered. When she was done, something had shifted in the room. She wasn't sure what exactly. He refilled her glass without asking. You said you have documentation. On a drive. Not digital. A physical drive, the kind you plug in. It's not with me. Where is it? She didn't answer that. He accepted the non-answer without pushing it, which told her more about him than a dozen questions would have. Get some rest, he said, and stood and picked up his pistol. I'll have someone show you upstairs. I'm not staying here. He looked at her. Where else are you going? She opened her mouth, closed it. The window she'd come through was a cold hole in the wall. Outside, the rain was still making its arguments on the pavement. She had no phone, no apartment, no plan that hadn't already failed. For tonight, she said, fine. For tonight, he agreed. He walked her to the base of the stairs himself and handed her off to a woman, not a man, which registered, who had the kind of face that had seen everything and decided long ago not to be moved by most of it. The woman's name was Nadia, and she managed whatever Lucien's building above the club was with the efficiency of someone who'd never had to consult a manual. From the top of the first landing, Bryn looked back down. Lucien had already turned away. He was talking quietly to the man with the close-cropped hair, Torres or Marcus, she'd lost track. And his posture communicated something that took her a moment to identify because she so rarely saw it directed at a situation involving her. He was treating it as his problem now. She didn't know what to do with that either. The room Nadia showed her was not what she'd expected from a building that operated as a criminal enterprise's headquarters, which meant she'd been holding the wrong expectations. It was a full apartment, kitchen, living space, a bedroom with actual furniture instead of a cot and a padlock. The window looked north toward the river, lights blurring in the rain. She sat on the edge of the bed and let the silence be what it was for a moment. Her ribs hurt. Her eye had stiffened. She was going to have bruising along her left arm from shoulder to elbow that was going to be impressive for weeks. Her mother had an appointment with the oncologist on Thursday. The treatment program began in 3 weeks. The money was already there. She'd moved it before any of tonight happened, the one part of the plan that had actually worked. Sharon Calloway was going to get her 60%. That was the one thing Bryn allowed herself to sit with for exactly 10 seconds before she put it away again, because she could not afford to feel it yet, and she was not going to cry in Lucien Devereaux's guest room. She was just not going to do that. She lay back on the bed and stared at the ceiling and listened to the rain. Somewhere below her she could hear the low murmur of voices, the particular cadence of a man giving measured orders to people who were going to carry them out without question. Tomorrow, she thought, she would figure out what she'd walked into. Tonight, she slept. She was so exhausted that she didn't hear the door at the end of the hall open at 2 a.m. Didn't hear Lucien stop outside it for a moment. Just a moment. The pause of someone checking on something they weren't prepared to name as concern yet, before moving on. She didn't hear the calls that went out in the next hour to 12 different numbers, each one connected to a different piece of Gavin Mercer's operation. She didn't hear Lucien tell his head of intelligence to pull everything, every account, every facility, every protection agreement, every name, on Gavin Mercer's network by morning. She didn't know that by the time the sun came up gray over the Chicago skyline, the mafia boss who'd asked her a single unexpected question had already decided that Gavin Mercer's days of running anything in this city were numbered. She didn't know any of that. What she knew, in the morning, when she woke up to find a set of clean clothes folded outside the door and the smell of actual coffee drifting from somewhere below, was that the world she'd stepped into through that shattered window was more complicated than any alley or fight card or illegal betting operation she'd ever navigated. And what she didn't know yet was that complication was about to get immeasurably worse, because Gavin Mercer didn't handle humiliation well. And somewhere on the west side of the city, in a building that smelled like blood and fight chalk and old money, a man was picking up a phone and making the kind of call you make when you've decided that the problem has to be solved in a way that leaves nothing behind, including the people you cannot be allowed to care about. The coffee was real. That was the first thing Bryn registered when she came back to consciousness. Not gently, not the way people woke up in places they felt safe, but the way she always woke up, which was all at once and already listening. The room was pale with early gray light filtering through curtains that actually blocked most of it, which meant the quality of darkness had been good enough to let her sleep longer than she had in weeks. Her body had simply refused to continue. The coffee smell was coming from below. Real coffee, not the burned bottom of the pot variety that sat on a warmer at the bar until it became something closer to tar. Someone down there was brewing something with intention. She lay still for 30 seconds and cataloged damage the way she always did after a bad night. Left ribs, cracked, not broken. She'd had broken before, and this was the lesser version of that particular misery, but still bad enough that turning over had woken her twice during the night. Left eye, swollen tight at the outer corner, the eyebrow above it pulled shut by medical tape she could feel but not see. Left arm. The bruising had set in full overnight. She could feel the specific heat of deep tissue damage running from her deltoid to her elbow. Her lower back had joined the conversation at some point, probably from the impact with the hardwood floor when she'd come through the window, a dull grinding ache that was going to make every action today cost her something extra. She sat up anyway. Cost was just math. The clean clothes outside the door fit well enough. Dark jeans, a gray thermal, both clearly chosen by someone who understood functional over decorative. No shoes, but her boots had survived the night. She put herself together in the bathroom, which had actual product in it rather than a bare bar of soap, and stood at the mirror for a long moment looking at what 3 weeks of fear and one bad night had done to her face. She looked older. She looked like someone who had made a decision she couldn't take back and was now living in the consequences of it. Good, she thought. Younger-looking people got underestimated. She couldn't afford that right now. She found the stairs and followed the coffee smell down past the level she'd come from, through a door that opened onto what turned out to be a private residence above the nightclub. Not an office, not a hotel corridor, but a space that someone actually lived in. High ceilings, windows looking north over the river. Furniture that had been chosen carefully and then lived with rather than showcased. Books. Actual books on actual shelves, not arranged decoratively but read, spines cracked and pages bent. Lucian was at the kitchen counter. He'd changed from last night. Different jacket, same quality, same dark palette. He had a phone in one hand and a coffee cup in the other and was reading something on the screen with the focused attention of someone who had already been working for hours. He looked up when she came in. "How are the ribs?" he asked. "Present," she said. He set the phone down and poured a second cup without asking and pushed it across the counter toward her. She picked it up and drank, and it was as good as it had smelled, which felt unreasonably significant given everything. "My doctor came at 6, he said. "You were still asleep. He'll be back at 10. "I don't need... You have at least one cracked rib and possibly 2. He needs to confirm that and tape them properly." He picked his phone back up, but he was still talking to her, and the combination was less dismissive than it would have been from anyone else. It was just efficiency. He was a man who processed multiple streams at once and treated that as normal. "Sit down." She sat at the counter. "Where's the drive?" he asked. She'd been expecting that. She wrapped both hands around the coffee cup and thought about it for exactly as long as the question deserved. Why? He set the phone down again and looked at her directly, which she was learning was the particular mode he shifted into when a conversation required his full attention. His eyes were darker than she'd registered last night. Not brown, something closer to black in certain light. The kind of eyes that held information without giving any back. "Because without it, everything you told me last night is a story," he said. "With it, it's evidence. And right now, evidence is the difference between me dismantling Gavin Mercer's operation legally and doing it the other way. You have a legal option? I have a federal contact who has been trying to build a case on Mercer's underground circuit for 14 months. He's been missing the financial thread." He paused. "You have the financial thread." Bryn looked at him. "You want to hand me to a federal agent? I want to use what you have to put Mercer away in a way that is permanent and doesn't require me to get blood on the floor I just had cleaned." He said it with the same tone he used for everything. Flat, even, carrying no particular heat. "You'd be a witness, not a defendant. With the documentation you described, your exposure is minimal. You borrowed money to pay a medical bill and kept records. That's not a prosecution. That's a press release. And what do you get out of it? Mercer's network goes through 3 of my territories. Every week he operates, he costs me money and creates friction I have to manage. Removing him through legitimate channels is cleaner than the alternative and doesn't invite federal scrutiny of my own operations." He picked up his coffee. "We both benefit." She sat with that. It was logical. It was the kind of offer that 2 months ago she would have taken immediately, except 2 months ago she hadn't stolen $42,000 from an organized crime figure and crashed through a mafia boss's window in the rain. "What if I don't want to be a witness?" she said. "Then I'll still keep Mercer's people off you for now, but the leverage you're sitting on depreciates fast. In 2 weeks he'll have rebuilt enough pressure to move against you outside my immediate reach." He set the cup down. "The drive is the thing, Bryn. Without it, you're a liability I'm managing. With it, you're an asset I can work with." "Asset," she repeated. "Yes." "Is there a version of this where I'm just a person?" He looked at her for a moment. Something moved in his face briefly, something that wasn't calculation. "Not yet," he said. "But there's a version where being an asset is a better situation than the one you were in when you came through my window." She couldn't argue with that. The drive is in a locker at Union Station, she said. Locker 417. The key is… She stopped. I need to get it myself. That's not possible right now. I'm not sending someone I don't know to get something that could put both me and my mother in worse trouble than we're already in. Your mother is currently safer than you are. Mercer's operation doesn't have a record of her as a connection point. He didn't know why you took the money, just that you did. He leaned forward slightly, forearms on the counter. But if you go to Union Station today, you'll have 4 of his people on you before you get through the main doors. Bryn thought about Jaw, about the flat professional patience of men who got paid to not stop. Fine, she said. Then we go together. He looked at her for a moment. Together. I get the locker. You bring whoever you want to bring, but I'm there, and I'm the one who opens it. A pause. Long enough to mean he was running through options rather than simply agreeing. This afternoon, he said, after the doctor. She nodded. He picked up his phone again. She drank her coffee and looked out the north windows at the river, which was the color of dirty chrome under the morning clouds, moving the way it always moved, indifferent and steady and a little bit cold. The doctor was thorough, which she appreciated, and didn't ask unnecessary questions, which she appreciated more. 2 cracked ribs, confirmed. Nothing displaced. The tape job he did was professional and significantly better than the self-wrap she'd been managing with athletic tape for the past few weeks. He gave her a course of anti-inflammatories, told her no significant impact to the torso for 3 weeks, and left without making eye contact more than clinically necessary. She got the feeling he'd seen a lot of things in this building and decided early on that curiosity was a professional liability. After he left, Nadia appeared with breakfast. Actual breakfast, eggs and toast, and something that had herbs in it that tasted better than anything Bryn had eaten in a month, and set it on the counter without commentary. Bryn ate all of it. She was finishing when she heard the voices. 2 of them coming from somewhere down the hallway that led to what she assumed was Lucian's actual office. Not loud, but she'd grown up in small apartments and learned early to read sound through walls. One was Lucian. The other was a voice she didn't know. Higher pitched, tighter, carrying an edge that the walls couldn't entirely contain. She finished her coffee, minded her business. But the edge in that second voice kept pressing at her attention. Then the words broke through. Told you from the beginning she was a problem. She couldn't hear Lucian's response, but the other voice came back harder. Mercer's already moving. He called Cavallo this morning. If Cavallo decides to back him instead of staying neutral, you've got a turf problem that goes past 1 woman and 1 drive. She heard the door and then nothing, because whoever had been talking had noticed that sound travels. Bryn set her cup down and thought about the name she'd just heard, Cavallo. She knew that name too. Everyone in the underground circuit knew that name, the same way they knew Devereaux, by its gravity, by the way other names behaved differently when it was mentioned. Cavallo was East Side, old money and new crime, the kind of organization that had been operating in Chicago longer than anyone currently running it had been alive. If Gavin Mercer was calling Cavallo, it meant he wasn't just trying to retrieve his money and his pride. He was trying to build something. The hallway door opened and a man came out who Bryn hadn't seen before, 40 or so, with the particular thinness of someone who moved fast and trusted information more than muscle, wearing a jacket that had too many pockets and the expression of someone who had made an argument and not won it. He stopped when he saw her. His eyes went over her the way an inventory goes over a shelf. Not threatening, just cataloging. "You're the woman from last night," he said. "Apparently," she said. "I'm Reeves." He didn't offer his hand. "I run intelligence for this operation." "Okay. You've created a significant problem, I've been told." "I don't think you've been told the full scope of it." He moved to the counter and picked up a tablet from somewhere she hadn't noticed and turned it toward her. On the screen was a map of Chicago with what looked like territorial overlays, colored zones running up from the south side, cutting east, overlapping in ways that looked like a bruise. Gavin Mercer operates here, here, and here. He pointed to 3 clusters. His operations abut ours in 2 places. We've had a working arrangement. He stays in his lanes, we stay in ours. Money moves without friction. Last night you ended that arrangement. Lucian ended that arrangement, she said, when he gave Mercer's men 10 seconds to leave. Reeves looked at her. "Yes," he said. He did. and something in the way he said it communicated very clearly that Reeves found this fact significant and was not entirely comfortable with the reason for it. "So you think he made a mistake?" she said. "I think," Reeves said carefully, "that decisions made at 2 in the morning in response to an unexpected situation should be evaluated in the morning when everyone has had time to think. He seems like he's thought about it. He's decided about it. That's different." Reeves took the tablet back. "You should understand that what happened last night has moved pieces that are going to be very difficult to move back. Mercer calling Cavallo is one of those pieces. What do you want me to do about it?" He looked at her steadily. "I want you to be honest with him about the full scope of what you took and how you took it. If there's something in those records that changes the shape of Mercer's operation, something bigger than what you've described, I need to know before we walk into Union Station." She held his gaze. "I told him everything." "You told him what you needed to tell him to secure a safe place to sleep." He said it without accusation, just precision. "That's what I would have done. That's what anyone rational would have done. But now we're past that stage." She looked at him for a long moment. He was right, which was annoying. She had told Lucian most of it. But there was one thing she hadn't said. One piece of what she'd found inside Gavin's accounts that had scared her more than anything else had. Something that went beyond fight promotions and betting operations and into something significantly larger and significantly less possible to explain with a sob story about a sick mother. She'd been holding that piece because it was the piece that, if anyone decided she was more dangerous than useful, could get her killed. "I'll talk to Lucian," she said. Reeves studied her for another moment. Then he put the tablet under his arm. "Make sure you do," he said, and walked back down the hallway. Lucian appeared about 4 minutes later, which told her he'd been listening, or Reeves had told him immediately, or both. He came into the kitchen without hurry and looked at her with the evaluating stillness she was starting to read as his baseline, not cold exactly, just profoundly contained. "What else is on the drive?" he said. She could feel the moment the way you feel a step before you take it, the instant where forward is chosen and backward closes. "There are payments," she said, "coming into Gavin's operation from outside the circuit, large ones. Not fight money. Fight money has a particular rhythm. It comes in clusters before cards and moves out within 48 hours. These are different, irregular, different source signatures." Lucian didn't move. "How large?" "The ones I found over 6 months, about 900,000 total." He was very still. "I don't know where it comes from," she said. "I'm a bartender, not a forensic accountant. But I know what regular criminal income looks like, and I know what that doesn't look like. And those payments don't look like anything Gavin should be generating from fight promotions." Lucian turned and looked out the north window. "Why didn't you tell me this last night?" he said. "Because last night I didn't know if you'd decide it was safer to have me disappear than to have me know about it." He turned back. There was something in his face that took her a moment to understand. Not anger, not calculation, but something more unsettled than either. "You thought I'd kill you." "I thought it was possible," she said. "You're a reasonable man. I didn't know yet what reasonable meant in your context." He looked at her for a long moment. "And now?" "Now I think," she said carefully, "that you're someone who made a decision last night based on something other than pure strategy, and you're too honest about it to reverse it, which means I'm probably safer telling you the truth than not." The silence held for several seconds. 900,000 in 6 months, he said. "At minimum. That's what I found before I had to stop looking." He picked up his phone, sent a message she couldn't see. Then he looked at her again. "You understand what this changes. It makes Mercer a different kind of problem. It makes Mercer someone else's operation," he said. "Which means when I move against him, I'm not just moving against a fight promoter." "Who?" she said. He shook his head. Not a refusal exactly. More the motion of someone who needed more information before answering a question like that out loud. "We get the drive," he said. "Then we know what we're actually dealing with." They went at 3 in the afternoon, 4 vehicles. Bryn in the second one with Lucian and 2 men she'd learned were called Santos and Pierce, who both had the settled competence of people who had made a career of being the last line between their employer and serious consequences. She sat in the back seat and watched the city go by outside the window. Chicago doing what Chicago did in early winter, steel gray and relentless, people moving fast against the cold with their heads down. Lucian sat beside her and didn't speak, and didn't look at his phone, which she was learning meant he was thinking rather than managing. There was something in the way he occupied space in a vehicle that was different from how he occupied space in his building. In the building, he was the fixed point and everything moved around him. In the car, he was still, watchful, taking in information from multiple directions simultaneously. She caught him looking at her twice. The second time, she didn't look away. "What?" she said. "You're calm," he said. "I fight for money. This is just different money." The corner of his mouth moved. "Different money. Everything is about money eventually." "Not everything." She looked at him. He was still watching the window, the city, the space between things. "What isn't?" she said. He didn't answer, which was an answer of its own kind. Union Station was busy enough in the mid-afternoon that 4 extra bodies moved through it without particular notice. Bryn led the way through the main hall with its high ceiling and faded glory, past commuters and tourist families and people who had that particular train station expression of being somewhere between 2 other places. Santos and Pierce flanked without hovering. They were good at appearing like 2 men who happened to be walking in the same direction rather than security. Lucian walked behind her and to the left, which she realized, belatedly, positioned him between her and the main entrance in case anything came through it. She noticed that kind of thing now. She'd been noticing it since breakfast. Locker 417 was in a bank of them on the lower level. She had the key in her boot, had put it there 2 nights ago, the night she'd moved the drive because she'd started to feel the shape of what was coming and needed her hands free. She crouched down and unlocked her boot and retrieved the small brass key and felt Lucian's attention on the back of her neck like a hand that wasn't touching her. The locker opened. The drive was where she'd left it, inside a sealed plastic envelope tucked inside a paperback she'd hollowed out, because she'd grown up around people who hid things and the best lessons she'd learned from her father before he stopped being someone she talked about were practical ones. She took it out and held it for a moment. Then she handed it to Lucian. He took it. He didn't open the envelope. He put it in his interior jacket pocket and looked at her with something she still didn't have a name for. "Thank you," he said. Simple. No performance. She closed the locker and stood up, and that was when she saw him. Not Jaw. A different one. Someone she didn't recognize specifically, but recognized categorically. Standing near the vending machines at the end of the locker corridor, with the particular stillness of someone who had been waiting rather than passing through. He was looking at his phone, and he was looking at it with the specific, careful attention of someone who was not looking at his phone. He'd seen her. She'd seen him see her. Santos and Pierce moved simultaneously, which told her Lucian had communicated something she'd missed. But the man was already pulling back, already turning, already moving toward the exit stairs at a pace that communicated urgency without quite becoming a run. "Don't," Lucian said quietly, and Santos stopped. The man disappeared up the stairs. Bryn turned to Lucian. "He saw me get it." "He saw you open the locker," Lucian said. He doesn't know what was in it, and in 20 minutes neither will Mercer's operation, because we'll have pulled everything onto our servers. He'll tell Mercer I'm with you. Mercer already knows you're with me." He looked at her steadily. "That's been decided since last night." She stood in the corridor with the sound of the station moving around them, and felt the particular vertigo of a situation that had changed shape while she was standing in it. This morning she had been a woman hiding in a borrowed room. This afternoon she had handed the most dangerous thing she owned to a man she'd known for less than 18 hours. "You said until this morning we'd negotiate what came next," she said. "I know. So negotiate." He looked at her in the low light of the locker corridor, the sound of the city muffled above them. "I want you in the building," he said. "Not indefinitely. Not as a prisoner. But while we process what's on that drive and determine who Mercer's money is coming from, I want you somewhere I can guarantee your safety." He paused. "Your mother's treatment begins in 3 weeks. I'll make sure nothing interferes with that." She wanted to say something that pushed back, because pushing back was what she did, and the alternative was acceptance, and acceptance made her feel like she was standing on something that might give way. But she was also out of drives, out of backup plans, out of running room. 3 weeks, she said. 3 weeks minimum, he said. After that, we reassess based on where things stand. She breathed through it, felt the tape on her ribs, the ache in her eye. Fine, He nodded, turned toward the exit. She fell into step beside him, and they went up the stairs and back through the station and out into the Chicago afternoon. And she didn't see the second man until they were almost at the cars. He was across the street, different from the one in the locker corridor. Older, better dressed, the kind of man who didn't work for Gavin Mercer because men like that were beneath him. He was watching their vehicle with an expression that had nothing in it except the calm, absolute attention of someone who was recording information for use later. Bryn looked at him for exactly as long as she could without being obvious about it. He wasn't Mercer's. She didn't know whose he was. But she knew, with the particular certainty that came from years of reading rooms and corners and the way bodies positioned themselves around power, that whoever had been sending $900,000 into Gavin Mercer's accounts had just put eyes on the woman who knew about it. She got in the car. She said nothing, but her hands, flat on her thighs in the back seat, pressed down hard against the fabric, and she felt Lucian register it without looking at her, felt the slight shift in his posture beside her that meant he'd noticed and was asking, without words, what she'd seen. She would tell him. She just needed to figure out first whether telling him put them both in the middle of something neither of them had been prepared for. Something larger than Gavin Mercer's anger, larger than a territorial dispute between criminal organizations, larger than anything she'd calculated when she'd decided that stealing $42,000 was a risk she could manage. The car moved into traffic. Outside, the man across the street was already gone. And somewhere in the city, a phone was ringing, and the person picking it up was about to learn that the woman who had found the payments was no longer... She told him in the car. Not everything at once. She wasn't built for that, for the full unspooling of information in one breath. She told him the way she did most things, economically, in the order that mattered. The man across the street, the quality of his attention, the suit that didn't belong to Gavin Mercer's budget, the way he'd been watching the vehicles rather than her. Lucian listened without interrupting. When she finished, he looked out the window for about 4 seconds. Then he said, "Describe him." She did. 50s. Silver at the temples. The particular posture of a man who had spent decades in rooms where other men deferred to him. Not physically imposing, didn't need to be. Lucian said nothing else for the rest of the drive. She understood by now that his silences weren't absence. They were processing. She let him have it and watched the city move past and thought about $900,000 arriving in irregular deposits into the accounts of a man like Gavin Mercer, who was brutal and greedy, but ultimately small. A local operator, a regional predator. Not the kind of figure who attracted that volume of outside money without providing something significant in return. The question she hadn't been able to answer from the financial records alone was what Gavin was providing. She thought she might know now. She didn't want to be right. Back at the building, Lucian took the drive directly to a room on the 3rd floor she hadn't been in. Locked, biometric entry. The kind of setup that communicated the room's contents were the kind you didn't want accessible by anyone who happened to be walking past. He went in alone. She stood in the hallway for a moment and then went back to the apartment because standing outside a closed door waiting for information was something she'd done too much of in hospitals, and she'd promised herself years ago that she was done with it. Reeves found her 20 minutes later. He came in without knocking, which told her the courtesy of knocking was situational in this building, and stood in the kitchen doorway with his tablet and the expression of someone who had just read something he'd have preferred not to. "You saw a man outside the station," he said. "Yes." Silver hair, blue overcoat, standing near the parking structure on Canal. She looked at him. "You have cameras on that block." "We have cameras on most blocks near transit hubs, standard operational coverage." He turned the tablet toward her. The image was good. Higher resolution than security camera standard, which meant it wasn't a security camera. The man was exactly as she'd described him. In the image, he was in partial profile, and the angle caught something she hadn't been able to see from across the street. A pin on his lapel. Small, silver, geometric. She didn't recognize it. Reeves did. She could see it in the way he was holding the tablet, not extended toward her in invitation, but angled, the way you hold something when you want someone to see enough but not take it from you. "Who is he?" she said. Reeves pulled the tablet back. "His name is Edmund Voss," he said. "He runs government relations for Harlan Consolidated." The name landed without weight because she didn't have context for it. "I don't know what that is." real estate development, infrastructure investment, publicly traded, well-regarded, the kind of company that gets mentioned in the same breath as civic improvement and economic development. He paused. They've been the primary developer on 4 major South and West Side projects in the last 3 years, all of them routed through city contract processes. She felt the shape of it before he said the next part. Gavin Mercer's fight venues, she said slowly. They're in South and West Side buildings. 3 of the 4 development sites have buildings currently operating as Mercer's facilities, Reeves said. The structures officially appear as commercial leases on Harlan's books. The actual use, he stopped. Doesn't appear on Harlan's books, she finished. No, she sat with that, felt it assembling itself in the part of her brain that had spent 3 weeks going over numbers, the part that had noticed irregular deposits and irregular timing and had been careful not to draw conclusions she couldn't support. The $900,000, she said. That wasn't Mercer receiving investment. That was Mercer receiving payment. For what? Reeves said, and the way he said it told her he knew the answer and was testing whether she did. She thought about the buildings, about what moved through Gavin's facilities besides fighters and bettors, about the particular usefulness to a publicly traded development company that needed clean infrastructure investments on paper, of illegal venues that generated cash and volume without leaving corporate fingerprints. Laundering, she said. Reeves said nothing. Harlan Consolidated is moving money through Gavin's operation, she said. He's not just a fight promoter, he's a washing machine. That's what we believe the drive will confirm, Reeves said. If it does, he stopped again. If it does, Bryn said, then Gavin Mercer is protected by people significantly more powerful than him. And whoever sent Edmund Voss to watch me pick up that drive knows that I know about the payments. Yes. How fast can you get through what's on the drive? Our analyst is on it now, depending on encryption, 3 to 5 hours. She stood up from the counter. How exposed am I right now? Between our security on this building and Mercer's current capacity, limited risk for the next 12 hours. He tucked the tablet under his arm. After that depends on what Harlan decides to do about Edmund Voss's report. She nodded, processed it. Where's Lucian? Still in the data room. She went to find him. He came out as she was approaching the door, which either meant good timing or he'd been watching the hallway camera, probably the second one. He looked at her and she looked at him and she said, Harlan Consolidated. His jaw shifted, almost imperceptible. Reeves told you. Reeves confirmed what I'd already worked out. She leaned against the hallway wall because the ribs were reminding her they existed and standing straight was a negotiation. You already knew about Harlan. It wasn't a question. She watched him decide how to answer. I knew about the buildings, he said. I didn't know the depth of the financial arrangement. I suspected Mercer had a corporate umbrella somewhere. His operation was too stable for its size, too protected. But I didn't have the source. The drive has the source. The drive has everything, he said. Account signatures, transfer records, the works. Our analyst can pull the full picture inside 2 hours. She looked at him steadily. You should have told me you already had part of this. You should have told me about the 900,000 last night. They looked at each other. Okay, she said, we're even. We're not even, but we're working with the same information now, which is more useful. She almost said something else. Didn't. The hallway was narrow enough that standing in it across from him had a different quality than rooms did. Less distance to manage, less space to default to. She was aware of him in the specific physical way she was trying not to be aware of him, which told her the trying wasn't working. What happens when the drive is processed? She said. I contact my federal connection. We move the evidence through a channel that keeps your name as protected as possible. Mercer and Harlan both get pulled into a federal investigation that neither of them can buy their way out of because the paper trail is too complete. He held her gaze. It works. It works cleanly. If Edmund Voss doesn't get to the drive first, he won't. She nodded, went back to the apartment. She didn't sleep that afternoon. She sat at the north window and watched the river and thought about her mother's Thursday appointment, about the Evanston facility, about the oncologist's face when he'd said 60%, about what 60% actually meant in practical terms. 3 people out of 5 survive, 2 don't, and the ones who don't aren't statistics. They're people who had Thursday appointments and treatment programs and daughters who stole money for them. Sharon Calloway didn't know about any of this. Bryn had told her the money came from a settlement, a fake one, a construction she'd built carefully enough that her mother had accepted it with the relieved exhaustion of a woman who was too sick to question things that worked out. The lie had tasted terrible, and she'd swallowed it anyway because her mother's peace of mind was worth it. If any of this got to Sharon before Bryn could manage it, she cut that thought off. One thing at a time. The call came at 7:43 in the evening. She heard Lucian's voice from down the hallway. Not the words, but the tone. The particular drop in register that meant something had changed. She was already getting up from the window when Nadia appeared in the doorway, and Nadia's face was doing something it hadn't done before. Something controlled, but underneath the control was an alert. "He wants you in the data room," Nadia said. The drive's contents were up on 3 screens. The analyst, a young woman named Kelsey, who looked like she hadn't slept since the second screen was added, was scrolling through columns of data that meant nothing to Bryn visually, but apparently meant a great deal to the 2 men standing behind her. Reeves was there. And Torres, who'd been introduced to her as Lucian's head of physical operations. Lucian was standing apart from all of them, in the corner of the room, facing the wall. Not dramatically. Not the performance of a man processing bad news. Just a man who needed 12 inches of private space before he could turn around and deal with what was behind him. He turned around when she came in. "The payments from Harlan go back further than 6 months," he said. "How far?" He 4 years, Kelsey said without looking up from the screen. "The oldest ones predate Mercer's current facility locations. He wasn't providing venues at the start. The structure of the early payments is different. More like salary than service fee." Bryn looked at Lucian. "He was recruited." "Harlan didn't find a useful criminal," Reeves said. "They built one, or expanded one. Mercer was operating on a smaller scale 4 years ago. Local fight promotion, minimal infrastructure. Harlan's capital is what scaled him up." "Why?" Bryn said. "Because a small-time fight promoter doesn't move enough cash to be useful," Torres said, from near the door. He had the expression of someone who understood the mechanics of this better than he'd like to. "You need volume. You need a cover operation large enough that the deposits don't look anomalous." 4 years, Bryn said. "That's 53 fighters," Kelsey said. She'd stopped scrolling. She was looking at one particular section of the screen. 53 fighters over 4 years, running through Mercer's cards. And the liability records here, she stopped. Nobody spoke. "These are injury payments," Kelsey said. Her voice had gone flat in the specific way of someone trying not to react to what they were reading. "Some of them are—" She stopped again. "There are 12 who don't have subsequent records. No further payments. No continued medical. No—" She turned from the screen. "I can't confirm what happened to them, but the payment pattern is consistent with settlements," Torres said. His voice was very quiet. The room held that. Bryn's hands went cold. She thought about the fight cards, about the ones she'd worked, the underground venues, the crowds, the money-changing hands, about the fighters she'd shared dressing rooms with, men and women who were doing it for the same reason she'd done it, because the circuit paid and the alternatives didn't. She thought about the ones she'd stopped seeing on cards without noticing she'd stopped seeing them. 12, she said. Nobody answered. 12 people, she said. "We don't know that," Reeves said. "The payment cessation is consistent with several explanations." "Reeves." Lucian's voice. Quiet. Final. Reeves stopped. "This has to go to the federal contact tonight," Lucian said. "Not tomorrow. Tonight. The data isn't fully processed yet. What's processed is enough." He looked at Bryn, and something in his face was different from anything she'd seen there before. Not shaken, not afraid, but stripped of the operational distance he usually kept between himself and whatever he was feeling. "I'm sorry," he said. "Don't," she said. "You didn't know this was what you'd found." "I said don't." She breathed through it. The ribs, the room, the 12. "Just fix it." He held her gaze for one more second, then turned to Torres. "Contact Hargrove, tonight. Whatever he needs, we give him." The next 3 hours were the kind of busy that has no texture, just action, following action in the flat, urgent way of crisis management. Lucian was on calls she wasn't part of. Reeves was in the data room with Kelsey. Torres was running a security reassessment of the building's perimeter because Harlan Consolidated's involvement changed the threat calculus in ways that a fight promoter's grudge hadn't. Bryn sat in the apartment and tried to locate the version of herself that handled things. She found it, the way she always found it, not by feeling better, but by deciding that feeling worse wasn't a productive use of the next hour. She'd found the money because she was looking for money. She'd found something else. She hadn't caused it. She hadn't known. Those facts didn't make the 12 people less dead or less disappeared or whatever they were, but they were accurate facts, and accurate facts were the floor you stood on when the rest of the room was moving. Her mother had an appointment on Thursday. She was going to be there for it. The call came at 11:17. Not to Lucien. To her. To the temporary phone Nadia had given her that afternoon. A clean number that nobody had, that she'd used to send one message to a contact at the Evanston facility confirming Thursday's appointment. The number calling her was her mother's home phone. She answered before the second ring. "Mom?" The voice on the other end was not her mother, Ms. Calloway. Male, measured, the voice of a man accustomed to being the one who initiated calls rather than received them. "Your mother's fine. She's right here. She'll stay that way as long as you make a good decision in the next few minutes." Bryn's body went completely still. Her brain went somewhere cold and clear and operational, the same place it went in a fight when she got hit hard and had to decide in under a second whether to go down or go forward. She went forward. "Let me hear her," she said. A pause. Then her mother's voice, strained, careful, the voice of someone managing fear with the dignity they had left. "Bryn, honey?" Then the first voice again. "You have what I need. You know what I mean." "The drive," she said. "The drive and whatever copies have been made. You'll understand that we're past the stage where the federal option is available to you. The moment your friend's analyst started pulling that data, certain alerts were triggered. Whatever Mr. Devereaux was planning to do with your federal contact is no longer viable. Those arrangements have been managed." She heard what he was saying, felt it land. "You own Hargrove," she said. "We own several things," he said, "including the next 12 hours of your mother's comfort." Her throat was doing something she refused to let become sound. "What do you want me to do?" "Come to us," he said. "Alone. There's a car outside the building on the east side, the blue sedan on Kinsey. The driver knows where to take you. Bring nothing except what was on the drive." A pause. "Every minute you wait is a minute your mother is somewhere uncomfortable. I don't think she needs that, given her health." The line went quiet, but didn't disconnect. He was leaving it open so she could hear the ambient sound of wherever her mother was. Bryn stood in the middle of the apartment with the phone against her ear and thought very fast. She thought about the transmitter Lucien had shown her that morning, a small flat disk, barely larger than a watch battery, that he'd pressed into her palm when they'd come back from Union Station. He'd said nothing about it. She'd looked at it and understood and put it in the small coin pocket of her jeans without commenting. She'd thought at the time that it was the gesture of a man who had seen too many situations go sideways and planned for the next one before it arrived. She thought about what Lucien would do if she disappeared without telling him. She thought about what would happen to her mother if she told him, and he made a decision that prioritized the evidence over Sharon Calloway's living room. She thought about 12 fighters with payment records that stopped. She thought about going forward. "I'll be there in 5 minutes," she said. She put the phone in her pocket and looked at the door and breathed. And then she did the only thing that fit the woman she'd decided to be about 6 years ago when she'd first stepped into an underground venue and understood that the only way to survive a fight was to commit to it completely. She went out the apartment door, down the hall, past the room where she could see light under Lucien's office door, and instead of stopping, she kept moving toward the building's east exit with her boots quiet on the floor and her hands loose at her sides and the transmitter in her pocket. The east exit door had a 2-second delay on the latch. She'd clocked it that morning without thinking about it, the way she clocked all exits, all delays, all the small mechanical facts of any space she occupied for longer than an hour. 2 seconds between handle and release, long enough that she had to stand there in the stairwell with her hand on the cold metal bar and count it out while the fluorescent light above her hummed its single note and her pulse did something she refused to call fear. 1, 2. The door opened onto an alley that ran east toward Kinsey, and the cold hit her immediately, that specific Chicago cold that didn't ask permission just moved through whatever you were wearing and introduced itself to your bones. She'd left without her jacket. She didn't go back for it. The blue sedan was exactly where he'd said it would be, idling at the curb with its lights off, exhaust drifting up into the amber dark. The driver was a shape behind fogged glass. She walked toward it, and her left hand was in her pocket, thumb pressed flat against the transmitter disc, and she pressed it once and held it and released it the way Lucian had shown her, one long, two short, which was the signal for a location that wasn't a public space, which was the closest thing to "I'm doing something dangerous," and it was my choice that the device allowed her to say. She got in the back seat. The driver didn't turn around. He was young. She caught the profile in the rearview mirror, mid-20s, the particular blankness of someone who was paid not to engage. He pulled away from the curb before she'd fully closed the door. They drove west. She watched the streets and counted turns and breathed through the tape on her ribs, which was doing its job, but the job was finite, and she could feel the finite edges of it every time the car hit a seam in the pavement. She thought about her mother's voice. Strained, careful, managing. Sharon Calloway had been managing things her entire adult life. Managing a husband who eventually stopped being worth managing. Managing a two-bedroom apartment on a teacher's aide salary. Managing a diagnosis that arrived like a sentence and then had to be lived with like a sentence, one day at a time. She was not going to let her mother get managed by Edmund Voss. The car stopped in front of a building on the near west side that wore its legitimacy carefully. Office exterior, signage that named a property management company, lights on in the upper floors at an hour when property management companies did not have people working. The driver's window went down and a gate opened and they pulled into an underground structure. Bryn got out before the driver turned off the engine. There were two men waiting at the elevator. Not Mercer's category, sir. Better dressed, better controlled, the kind of men who operated in the space where criminal infrastructure and corporate infrastructure overlapped and dressed for the corporate side of that meeting. They didn't touch her. They just positioned themselves, one ahead and one behind, and the elevator opened and she stepped in because the alternative was a parking garage and her mother's voice. The elevator went to the 6th floor. The room they brought her to was a conference room. Long table, chairs, a window that looked south over a block of darkened warehouses. And at the far end of the table, standing with his hands in his pockets and his silver hair catching the overhead light, was Edmund Voss. He looked at her the way she'd seen him look at Lucian's car on the street outside Union Station, with the calm, absolute attention of someone who had already run the calculations and was simply waiting to confirm the answer. "Ms. Calloway," he said. "Thank you for coming." "My mother," she said. He gestured to a chair. She didn't sit. "Your mother is comfortable," he said. "She's in a car 2 blocks from her apartment with a woman who is providing her with tea and making sure she doesn't try to use her phone. She's frightened but unharmed. That situation remains stable as long as this conversation remains productive." "Where's the drive?" "The drive is irrelevant at this point," Voss said. "What's on it has already been accessed by Mr. Devereaux's analyst. The question isn't the drive anymore. It's who controls the narrative around what was found on it." He moved to the side of the table, unhurried. "Sit down, Ms. Calloway. You look like you're about to fall over." Her ribs were broadcasting on a frequency that was becoming hard to ignore. She sat, because vertical wasn't a principle worth the cost of maintaining it right now. "You said the federal option is gone," she said. "That you own Hargrove. We have a relationship with Agent Hargrove, yes. A financial one predating his federal appointment by several years." He sat down himself across the corner of the table from her, the configuration of someone who wanted to communicate conversation rather than interrogation. "I want to be clear with you about something, Ms. Calloway. I'm not interested in harming you. I'm not interested in harming your mother. I'm interested in a workable outcome." 12 people, she said. Something moved in his face. Not guilt. She didn't think men like Voss had the architecture for guilt at this level. Something more like the acknowledgement of a problem. The situation with certain fighters was managed by Mercer independently of Harlan's directives. We provided infrastructure and capital. What Mercer did with certain liabilities, don't, she said. He stopped. "Don't call them liabilities," she said. He looked at her for a moment. "The people you're referring to were not targets of Harlan's operation. Mercer made decisions that exceeded the scope of, you wrote the checks," she said. "For 4 years. You knew what the venues were. You knew what moved through them." She held his eyes. You built him. You said so yourself. Voss was quiet. She could feel her own pulse in her temples, in her ribs, in the specific ache behind her left eye. She was angrier than she'd been since this started. Not the hot, panicked anger of running through rain, but something colder and more deliberate. The anger of someone who had come through enough to be sitting in this chair having this conversation and was going to see it through to the end of it. What do you want from me? She said. Your cooperation, he said. Specifically, whatever copies were made from the drive are destroyed. The financial records you personally compiled, which are thorough, I'm told, are surrendered to us. In exchange, your mother receives no further contact from us. Her treatment proceeds without interference, and you receive a financial arrangement that reflects the inconvenience you've experienced. He paused. A significant one. And Mercer? Mercer's relationship with Harlan is concluding regardless of this conversation. He's become a liability. He stopped himself this time, adjusted. He's become untenable, that's already in motion. And the 12 fighters? Voss looked at her. Ms. Calloway. I want to know what happened to them. That information. I'm not asking you to confess to anything, she said. I'm asking you to tell me what happened to them. He looked at her for a long moment. The conference room was very quiet. Somewhere in the building's ventilation system, air moved through a duct and made a sound like someone trying not to breathe. Several of them are alive, he said, under arrangements that removed them from the circuit and from Chicago. 2 are not. His voice was flat. Not regretful, not defiant. Just factual. The way a man gives facts when he's decided that managing your reaction is more important than acknowledging the weight of what he's saying. Mercer's decisions, not Harlan's directives. She sat with those 2 words for a second. 2 are not. She thought about Lucian's face in the data room when Kelsey had stopped scrolling. The stripped down something she'd seen there. The apology she hadn't wanted. She pressed her thumb against the transmitter in her pocket. 1 long, 2 short. 1 long. She didn't know if Lucian was even looking at the signal. She didn't know if he'd followed her immediately or if he was waiting, running calculations, deciding whether one woman and her sick mother was a cost he could justify against the larger operation. She didn't know what he was to her, not in any language she had available. Not friend, not employer, not the other things she'd been trying not to name since the morning she'd watched him drink coffee, with the particular solitude of a man who had spent so long being feared that he'd forgotten what it felt like to be just present with another person. She knew she'd handed him the drive. She knew that meant something in the specific calculus of her own behavior that she was still working out. She looked at Edmund Voss. I need to make a call, she said. I'm afraid to tell my mother she's going to be released, she said. She has a medical condition. Stress is a documented factor. If something happens to her tonight because you're holding her in a car and she doesn't know why, that's a problem for both of us. She held his gaze. You said you want a workable outcome. Let me tell her she's safe and she'll be home in an hour. That's good faith. Voss studied her. Then he reached into his jacket and produced a phone and placed it on the table in front of her. She picked it up and dialed her mother's number and waited. The woman who answered, the one with the T, was careful and professional, and said her mother was right there, and Sharon Calloway's voice came on and Bryn said, Mom, I need you to listen to me and not ask questions yet. You're going to be home in less than an hour. Are you okay? Her mother said yes, in the voice of a woman who was absolutely not okay, but who had decided to be okay for her daughter's sake, which was the most Sharon Calloway thing possible. And Bryn's chest did something complicated that she compressed immediately into the area behind her sternum and left there for later. I love you, Bryn said. I'll call you from home. She hung up and put the phone on the table. Good faith, she said to Voss. He nodded. The door behind her opened. She felt it before she heard it. The displacement of air, the sound of the latch, the particular silence of men entering a room while trying not to be heard entering a room. She turned in the chair. Gavin Mercer walked in like a man reclaiming something. He looked worse than she'd ever seen him. The controlled, expensive presentation she'd known from fight nights was gone, replaced by a looseness around the jaw and eyes that came from 3 days of pressure. His suit was still good, but the man inside it was smaller somehow, brittle in the way things get when they've been squeezed too hard from too many directions. Behind him were 2 men who were very large and very focused on her specifically. She looked from Mercer to Voss. Voss's expression had shifted. Not surprise, something more complex. The expression of a man watching a variable he thought he'd managed come back into the equation. Gavin, Voss said. His voice had a particular quality, a warning dressed as a name. I told you I wanted to be here, Mercer said. He wasn't looking at Voss. He was looking at Bryn, and the looking had a quality she recognized because she'd seen it across tables in the back of fight venues. The focused, personal anger of a man who needed to see someone reduced in order to feel safe again. I want to hear it from her. That's not what we agreed. I want to hear her say she'll give back what she took. Mercer moved to the near end of the table and put both hands on the surface and leaned forward, and Bryn held herself very still and looked at him with the quality of attention she used in the ring, not meeting aggression with aggression, just cataloging it. Position, weight distribution, the distance between his hands and her body. Everything, he said. The money, the records, everything you built against me. The money went to my mother's treatment, she said. You know that. I don't care. Gavin, Voss said, sharper. I don't care what it went to, Mercer said. You stole from me. You went into my accounts and you took from me and then you went to him. The word carried everything he felt about Lucien Devereaux. A lifetime of territory anxiety and envy, and the specific humiliation of being given 10 seconds to retreat from a building. You went to him with my information, and you handed my operation to him on a drive. Your operation, she said, was a laundromat for a real estate company. The room went very still. She hadn't planned to say it, but something about the way he'd said my operation, the genuine, aggrieved possession of a man who'd convinced himself it was his, had made the words come up without asking. Mercer stared at her. You think you built something, she said. You didn't. They built you. Voss and whatever Harlan Consolidated needed, they found you and they scaled you up because you were useful. The fight clubs, the circuit, the venues. You were a service provider. She held his gaze. You were their washing machine. The sound Mercer made was not quite a word. He came around the table fast. Not fast enough. Not controlled enough. The speed of a man who had been humiliated past the point where decisions happened. And Bryn was already moving, already out of the chair and sideways because the chair was the trap and the space to the left of it was not. His hand caught her shoulder, the bad one, and the pain was white and total, and she used it the way she'd learned to use pain, as information rather than interruption, and turned into it instead of away and drove her elbow up and back into the space below his jaw. Mercer went down, not out, down. One knee on the conference room carpet, making a sound like a man who had expected a completely different outcome. The two large men behind him moved, and the window behind Voss exploded inward. Not glass, safety glass, the kind that breaks into pebbles, rattling across the conference table like something had been thrown through it, which something had. Santos came through it first, and the fact that they were on the 6th floor registered for exactly 1 second before she understood that the building's fire escape ran along the exterior and Lucien had found the signal. Torres came through the door. The two men who'd been moving toward Bryn turned toward the new information, and that was the exchange, the moment where attention is divided and divided attention loses. And Santos and Torres moved through that moment with the specific efficiency of people who had trained for exactly this kind of room. It lasted about 45 seconds. At the end of 45 seconds, both of Mercer's men were on the floor, and Mercer was still on one knee looking at his hands, and Voss was standing at the far end of the table with the expression of a man rapidly revising every decision he'd made in the last 12 hours. Lucien came through the window last. He looked at her first. Not at the room, not at Mercer, not at Voss. At her. A single pass, head to foot, the inventory of damage, and then something in his face settled into a particular stillness that she was learning to read as the moment after he confirmed she was alive, and before he decided what happened next. Then he looked at Voss. Voss looked back with the remarkable composure of a man who had perhaps considered this scenario and prepared a response for it. Mr. Devereaux, he said, this is Edmund Voss, Lucien said. Harlan Consolidated. Government Relations. He walked around the end of the table toward him, and his voice had the quality his voice got when he was most controlled, which was also when he was most dangerous. The inverse relationship between his volume and his intent that Bryn had clocked on the first night when he'd given Gavin's men 10 seconds in the rain. You've had your people in 3 of my territories for 4 years. You had a financial arrangement with an organization operating inside my network without my knowledge. You moved against a woman under my protection tonight. Voss said nothing. You had a federal agent, Lucian said. I have 2 of them. Voss's composure developed a hairline fracture. The records from this drive, Lucian said, were transmitted 40 minutes ago to contacts at the federal level who are not in your Rolodex. The transmission was complete before Ms. Calloway left my building. He stopped 2 feet from Voss and looked at him with the flat, clear attention of a man who has made all his decisions and is now just executing them. Whatever arrangement you thought you were negotiating tonight is already history. The hairline fracture spread. Hargrove is currently explaining his financial relationship with Harlan Consolidated to his supervisor, Lucian said, who received a file from me at 9:45 this evening. A pause. I've had that file for 6 months. I was missing the financial thread. Now I have it. Bryn stood at the near end of the table with the pain in her shoulder doing something complex and comprehensive and watched Edmund Voss understand that he had been managed by a man who had led him believe he was the one doing the managing. Mercer was still on one knee. He looked up at Lucian with the expression of a man who had run out of road and knew it. Lucian looked at him for a long time, long enough that the room became uncomfortable around the looking. Then he turned to Torres. Take him. Wait, Mercer said. The people who stopped showing up on your cards, Lucian said. The ones whose payments stopped. He looked at Mercer, and his voice was so quiet it was almost not a voice at all, just the shape of words with all the performance taken out of them. I'm going to find out where they are. Every one of them. You're going to help me. Mercer stared at him. Or, Lucian said, I'll leave you for the federal agents to find. And what they'll find, with Voss's cooperation. He glanced at Voss, who was doing something with his face that looked like a man calculating his own survival math as fast as he could. Will constitute a charge profile you will not survive intact. The room held it. Torres moved Mercer upright and out through the door. Santos had Voss's phone and jacket and was looking at a watch that Bryn suspected contained something other than timekeeping equipment. Lucian turned to her. She was still standing at the near end of the table, and her shoulder was informing her, in detailed and emphatic terms, that the elbow she'd used on Mercer had been drawn from a reserve account that was now significantly overdrawn. Her ribs had opinions. Her eye had opinions. Her legs were staging a preliminary discussion about their continued cooperation. He crossed the room to her. He stopped close, the same narrow distance as the hallway outside the data room that morning, the distance that existed below the threshold of what could be managed by looking somewhere else. You pressed the signal, he said. I pressed the signal, she said. You could have told me. You might have made a different decision, she said, about the drive, about the transmission timing, about whether my mother was the priority. He looked at her. She was always the priority. She didn't know what to do with that. She was finding that she didn't know what to do with a lot of things where he was concerned, and the list was getting longer. The transmission was already done, she said. Before I left. Before you left, he confirmed. You let me go. A pause. I saw you on the hallway camera, he said. I saw the transmitter signal. I gave you 4 minutes, and then I moved. Something in his face, underneath the control. 4 minutes was the longest 4 minutes I have managed in recent memory. She looked at him in the wreckage of the conference room with glass pebbles on the table, and 2 of Mercer's men on the floor, and Edmund Voss calculating his survival odds in the corner, and she felt the specific vertigo of a person standing at the edge of a decision they've already made without fully acknowledging they made it. My mother, she said. Santos is already en route to her location, he said. She'll be home within 20 minutes. She nodded. Her legs completed their discussion and reached a conclusion she didn't agree with, and she put one hand on the conference table because the alternative was the floor, and she had too much remaining dignity for the floor. Lucian's hand found her arm, the right one, not the damaged left, and the steadiness of it was so straightforward, so without performance, that it was almost worse than the shoulder. I've got you, he said. 2 words. No architecture to them. Just the flat, plain fact of the thing, offered without asking for anything back. She let herself be steady against it for exactly 1 second. Then she straightened and looked at Edmund Voss, who was watching them with the expression of a man who had come here tonight thinking he was the most powerful person in the room and was recalibrating that assessment in real time. "The two fighters," she said to Voss. "The ones who aren't alive. I want names." Voss looked from her to Lucien. Lucien said nothing, just waited. Voss reached into his jacket for a pen, found the notepad on the conference table still intact among the glass pebbles, and wrote two names, slid it across the table. Bryn picked it up. She looked at the names for a long moment. Two names, two people, two lives that had moved through the same circuit she'd moved through for 2 years, and ended in a way that nobody had accounted for in any paperwork she'd ever seen. She folded the paper and put it in her pocket next to the transmitter. Outside the 6th floor window, Chicago pressed against the glass with all its cold and noise and indifference. And somewhere 2 blocks away, her mother was in a car drinking tea and not knowing yet that the worst of it was over. And somewhere in a federal building on Dearborn, a supervisor was reading a file that Edmund Voss had not known existed. And somewhere in the data that Kelsey had pulled from a drive hidden inside a hollowed-out paperback were the names of 53 fighters who had moved through illegal venues for 4 years, and 12 of whom had... The names on the folded paper were Marcus Webb and Delia Fuentes. Bryn didn't look them up that night. She kept the paper in her pocket the way you keep something that requires a particular kind of readiness before you open it fully. The kind of readiness that didn't exist at midnight in a wrecked conference room with glass on the floor and a shoulder that had stopped sending specific pain signals and moved into the general broadcast of everything hurts now, which was somehow worse because it removed the useful information and left only the noise. Lucien got her out of the building and into a vehicle, and she sat in the back seat and didn't speak, and he sat beside her and didn't speak either, which was the right thing, the only thing, because words at that moment would have been inadequate in ways that the silence at least had the decency not to pretend otherwise. Santos confirmed her mother was home at 12:41. Bryn texted the temporary phone, one word, home, and Sharon Calloway responded in 30 seconds with a string of punctuation that communicated a level of maternal distress that Bryn was going to have to account for in a real conversation very soon. She put the phone in her pocket and leaned her head back against the seat and closed her eyes and felt Chicago moving under the vehicle, the particular rhythms of the streets at this hour, the city doing its overnight work of being itself. She thought about Marcus Webb. She thought about Delia Fuentes. She didn't know their faces yet. She would find them. She already knew she would find them the way you know things that have already been decided by the person you actually are, rather than the person you're trying to manage. 2. The words sat in her chest like a stone she was going to have to carry rather than put down. Back at the building, Nadia was waiting. No expression, no questions, just the steady presence of a woman who had seen returns from situations she didn't ask about and knew how to be useful in the aftermath. She looked at Bryn's shoulder and disappeared and came back with ice and something that smelled medicinal and said, "Sit," in the tone of a person who has converted all maternal instinct into pure efficiency. Bryn sat. Lucien went to the data room. She could hear him and Reeves and Kelsey through the wall. Not words, just the particular sound of people working through a problem that still had components requiring management. Federal timelines. Voss's cooperation agreement, which his lawyers had already been called about, and which was going to be a negotiation measured in weeks, not hours. The 50 fighters whose records were now in federal hands, and who needed to be contacted, located, given whatever accounting was possible for what had been done to them inside Gavin Mercer's venues. 12 of them, 10 located, 2 not. Bryn sat with the ice on her shoulder and the paper in her pocket and let Nadia work on the shoulder in silence, and thought about the specific mathematics of what a life costs when someone decides it's a liability rather than a life, and what it costs the people who loved those lives when the accounting came due. She stayed in the building for 4 more days, not because Lucien asked her to, not because she was afraid, but because the federal process required her availability. There were calls with agents who were not Hargrove, agents whose names she didn't recognize and whose voices carried the particular texture of people who had been handed something they hadn't expected and were still working out how to hold it without dropping it. She gave them everything, every number, every transfer record, every note she'd made in the back booth of the bar on slow Tuesday nights. She answered questions for 3 hours on the second day and 2 hours on the third, and sat across a table on the fourth day from a woman named Agent Carver, who had the kind of face that had been made by years of sitting across from people and deciding whether they were telling the truth. Agent Carver looked at her for a long time after the questions were done. "You kept better records than our forensic accountants," she said. "I knew I'd need them," Bryn said. "For what?" "For exactly this," Bryn said. "For a table with someone like you." Carver looked at her for another moment. Then she closed her folder. "Your exposure is minimal. The documentation demonstrates intent to repay an absence of personal enrichment. The DA's office will not be pursuing charges." Bryn let out a breath she'd been managing since the night she'd opened Gavin's secondary accounts for the first time. "Mercer?" she said. "Cooperative," Carver said, with the particular dryness of someone describing something that wasn't cooperation, so much as a man discovering that cooperation was the only option that preserved any version of his future. "He's provided information that is extensive. Whether he understood the full scope of what Harlan was doing through his operation or chose not to understand it is a conversation his defense attorney is going to have with a jury." "And Voss?" "Edmund Voss and 3 members of Harlan Consolidated's executive board are facing charges that carry significant federal exposure." Carver stood, extended her hand. "Miss Calloway, the people you found, the fighters, some of them are going to be able to come home because of what was on that drive." Bryn shook her hand. She sat alone in the room for a few minutes after Carver left. Not long. Just long enough to let the fact of it settle. The thing she'd started, which had been a terrified act of desperation for one woman's life, had become something else along the way without her planning it. She hadn't intended to be anyone's instrument of justice. She'd intended to save her mother. Both things had happened, and the second one was going to cost her a kind of weight she'd be carrying for a long time. The weight of 2 names on a folded piece of paper, the weight of 10 fighters who were alive and had a chance now, and 12 who had needed someone to find them 3 years earlier than anyone had. She stood up and went to find Lucian. He was in the space she'd come to think of as his actual office. Not the data room, but the room with the books and the north window where she'd had coffee on the first morning. He was at the desk with his jacket off and his sleeves rolled to the elbow, looking at something on paper, and he looked up when she came in with the particular quality of attention that was, she had determined over 4 days, specific to her. He didn't look at other people entering rooms the same way. She'd watched enough to be certain. "Carver's done," she said. "I know." He'd gotten the same calls, she supposed. The federal process had required his participation too, in ways that his lawyers had spent considerable effort managing. Lucian Devereaux's criminal infrastructure had not been the subject of this particular investigation and was not going to become one, a situation that Agent Carver had communicated with the practiced neutrality of a woman who understood that outcomes required tools, and tools had their own histories. "Sit down," he said. She sat in the chair across the desk. They looked at each other. This was something they'd gotten good at in 4 days. The particular communication of 2 people who had been through something together and were still finding the language for what it had left them. There was a lot of looking. There was a lot of the almost something that existed in the 3 feet between her chair and his desk. "Mercer's venues," she said. "What happens to the buildings?" "Harlan's development company is under federal review. The buildings are effectively frozen pending the investigation." He set his pen down. 3 of them are in communities that were relying on the development contracts for employment and infrastructure. The projects themselves weren't criminal, only the funding mechanism. So the communities get punished for what Harlan did, not if someone legitimate takes over the contracts, he said. And the way he said it, the particular evenness of it, told her it wasn't theoretical. She looked at him. "You're going to take the contracts." "My organization is in the process of establishing a legitimate development arm," he said. "It's been in process for 2 years. This accelerates the timeline." He held her gaze. "The venues will be converted. The fight circuits Mercer ran will be closed. But the buildings can be something else." "What?" He was quiet for a moment. "That depends on who we put in charge of them." She understood what he was saying. She sat with it the way you sit with something large, letting it take up the space it needed without immediately trying to reduce it. "That's not a small ask," she said. "No," he agreed. "I'm a bartender." "You're a bartender who dismantled a money laundering operation, survived 3 separate attempts to either retrieve or eliminate you, managed to negotiate her own safety and her mother's simultaneously, and kept documentation thorough enough that a federal agent complimented it. He leaned back slightly. The bartender thing is a job. What you actually are is something else. She looked at the desk, at the pen he'd set down, at the paper he'd been working on when she came in, which was covered in his handwriting. Dense, precise, the handwriting of a man who thought through things on paper before he thought through them out loud. The two fighters, she said. Marcus Webb and Delia Fuentes. He didn't look away. We found Marcus Webb. Her breath caught. Alive? Alive, he said, in Milwaukee. He left the circuit 2 years ago after an injury that Mercer's people told him would be covered and then wasn't. He has a wife, a son. He paused. He doesn't know yet that what happened to him is part of a federal case. He will when Carver's team contacts him, but he's alive. She let that through, felt it properly. Delia Fuentes. Lucian's face did the thing it did when the information was the hard kind. We haven't located her yet. Carver's team is still working it. She nodded, pressed her hands flat on her thighs. Okay. Okay, he said. I want to know when they find her, she said. Whatever they find. You'll know. She looked at him in the late afternoon light coming through the north window and thought about the night she'd come through the glass. The way the world had tilted, the specific terrible piece of the half-second between the window and the floor. The way he'd come out of the shadow with a gun and asked the one question nobody else had thought to ask. You could have just had them drag me back onto the street, she said, that first night. Yes, he said. Why didn't you? He looked at her for a long moment. Because you came through my window covered in blood, and the first thing you did when you could stand was tell me there were men outside, he said. You weren't asking me to protect you. You were warning me. A pause. I'd been a long time since someone thought to do that. She held his gaze. That's a very specific reason to upend your entire operation. It's the reason I have, he said. The room held it. She stood up and walked around the desk and stopped next to his chair and looked down at him, which was the first time she'd had the height advantage in any configuration between them, and he looked up at her with the stripped-down quality she'd seen in the data room, the look under the control, the thing that existed when he wasn't managing how much of himself was visible. She reached out and put her hand against his jaw, which was the most direct thing she'd done since she'd handed him the drive, and he went very still, the way he went still when something required full attention. I'm going to call my mother, she said, and then I want to hear the rest of what you were working on when I came in. He turned his face slightly into her hand, the smallest motion, the full weight of it. All right, he said. She called Sharon Calloway from the apartment and talked for 40 minutes, which was the longest phone conversation she'd had with her mother in 3 years. Sharon had questions. She had many, many questions. The accumulated questions of a woman who had been placed in a car by strangers and given tea and not told why, who had received one cryptic call from her daughter and then silence for 4 days, who had been through enough in her life to know when she was being protected from something and to have very specific feelings about that. Bryn answered the one she could and said not yet to the rest, and Sharon, to her credit, accepted not yet with the grace of a woman who had learned that some things had to be processed before they could be spoken. She told her the treatment program was confirmed. Thursday still. She heard her mother cry for about 30 seconds on the other end. The quiet kind. The kind Sharon Calloway did alone when she thought nobody was listening. And Bryn held the phone and looked at the north window and said, I know, Mom, which were the only words available and also somehow the exact right ones. The Thursday appointment happened. The oncologist, Dr. Mehta, 50-ish, careful with words in the way of someone who had delivered enough bad news to have developed genuine precision about when to use them, sat across from them both and went over the treatment protocol and the timeline and the monitoring process and said, without drama, that the preliminary response indicators were positive. Positive. Sharon Calloway reached across the clinic table and took Bryn's hand and held it, the way mothers hold things they're terrified of losing. And Bryn let herself be held and looked at the window of the examination room and felt something enormous and shapeless moving through her that she had been keeping outside for too long. She let it in. It wasn't a good feeling. It wasn't a bad feeling. It was just real. The size of what had almost not happened. the size of what still could. The distance between the stage 3 diagnosis and this chair in this clinic and the hands between them, and all the mileage of the $42,000 and the drive and the glass and the man who'd asked the right question. She drove her mother home and stayed for dinner, which was soup because Sharon was in the careful eating phase of the protocol, and they sat at the kitchen table in the apartment that smelled like the same apartment it had always smelled like. Something herbal and faintly warm, the smell of a home that had been made deliberately rather than arriving by accident, and talked about things that had nothing to do with any of it. A neighbor's new dog, a television program Sharon had been watching, the particular insufficiency of the soup, which Sharon felt needed more salt, but the protocol said otherwise. It was the most ordinary evening Bryn had spent in months. She drove back to the building at 9, and Lucian was in the kitchen with coffee that was too late in the day for coffee and a newspaper that he was reading in the old-fashioned way, folded to a quarter, one section at a time. He looked up. "How is she?" "Positive preliminary indicators," Bryn said. Something shifted in his face. Not a smile exactly. More than that, something with more territory to it. Something she'd earned the right to read correctly. "Good." She sat at the counter. He poured her coffee without asking. They sat in the kitchen with the city outside the north window and the coffee and the sound of whatever Chicago was doing out there in the dark. And it was not so different from the most ordinary evening she'd just spent, which was something she was going to need time to understand. Over the following weeks, the shape of things changed. Not dramatically, not in the way movies move through montages, the quick compression of time that skipped the actual texture of change and went straight to its results. In the real version, change arrived in the small units of days, in decisions made and remade, in the accumulation of ordinary mornings. Gavin Mercer's federal proceedings began. He testified for 11 hours on the first day, which Carver communicated to Bryn in a text that said simply 11 hours. The number communicated everything it needed to about how much Mercer had been storing and how fast it came out once the container was removed. His venues were formally frozen. The organizations that had operated through them, the fight circuits, the betting operations, the entire infrastructure that Harlan's capital had scaled up over 4 years, stopped operating within the first week. Edmund Voss negotiated a cooperation agreement of his own, which his very expensive attorneys secured in exchange for testimony against 3 members of Harlan's board who were apparently significantly more exposed than Voss himself. Bryn read about it in a newspaper article that described Harlan Consolidated as a development company under federal scrutiny and Voss as an executive cooperating with investigators, and felt the particular inadequacy of newspaper language for the specific reality of a man who had held her mother in a car and told her 2 people were dead. She folded the paper and put it in the recycling and made coffee and went to work. The work by that point was the academy. It had started as a conversation in Lucian's office about what to do with one of Mercer's former venues, a building on the west side that had been a legitimate gym once, before Harlan's money and Mercer's operations had converted it, and which still had the bones of something that could be good. The conversation had lasted 3 hours and had covered budget and staffing and program design and liability and a dozen other practical things. And at the end of it, she'd gone home and lain awake until 2 in the morning running numbers in her head. The same focused, obsessive attention she'd given the accounting work. And by the morning, she'd had a framework. She brought it to him with 3 pages of handwritten notes. He read all 3 pages without interrupting. "The women who were exploited in Mercer's circuit," she said, "some of them have skills. Fighters, trainers, people who know how to move and how to teach movement. They're not going to suddenly have opportunities in a legitimate industry. The underground circuit isn't a resume item. But if there's a facility that's already operating, that's already staffed by people who came from the same place they came from, you become the resume item," he said. "I become the door," she said. "They walk through it themselves." He looked at her. Then he looked at the 3 pages. Then he said, "What do you need?" She told him. He gave her more, which she argued with, and they landed on a number that was practical rather than lavish, which was what she wanted, because lavish didn't last and practical did. The name came later. Not her idea. It came from one of the first women she recruited as an instructor, a fighter named Gwendolyn, who had been on Mercer's cards for 3 years and whose payment records were in the federal case file. Gwendolyn had looked at the building on the first walkthrough and said, "Whose name is going on this?" And Bryn had said she hadn't decided, and Gwendolyn had said it should be yours. And the directness of it, the matter-of-fact, unperformative way it was offered, had made the decision easier than it should have been. Callaway Women's Defense Academy. The sign went up on a Wednesday morning in late winter, and Bryn stood on the sidewalk and looked at it for a long time in the cold. The building behind it was still being finished inside. There were contractors working on the second floor, the smell of fresh paint drifting down when the door opened, but the exterior was done and the sign was up. And the thing existed now in the physical world, rather than only in the 3 pages of handwritten notes she'd brought to a man's office 7 weeks ago. Lucian had driven her there. He was behind her, on the sidewalk, not standing beside her, giving her the view of her own name on her own building without his presence in the frame of it. She understood that. She turned and looked at him. He had his hands in his jacket pockets, and his face open in the particular way it opened when he wasn't managing the distance. "You're not going to take any credit for this," she said. "No," he said, "not even to your own people." "Not even then." She looked at him for a moment. "That's going to drive Reeves insane." "Reeves will survive." She walked back to him across the sidewalk and stopped in front of him, and he took his hands out of his pockets and she put her arms around him, which was not something she'd done before, and he put his around her, which was not something he'd done before. And they stood on the sidewalk in front of the building with her name on it in the late winter cold, with the contractors making noise on the second floor and the city doing its thing around them. She felt him exhale, fully, completely. The breath of a man putting something down. "I found her," he said, into her hair, quiet. She pulled back far enough to look at him. "Delia Fuentes," he said. "Carver called this morning. She's in Phoenix. She's alive." He paused. "She left the circuit 18 months ago. She has a daughter." Bryn looked at him. She felt it move through her. The 2 names she'd been carrying, the stone weight of them, and now one side of that weight lifting. Not disappearing, not becoming nothing, but shifting. Becoming something that could be born differently, carried in a different configuration. Delia Fuentes was alive in Phoenix with a daughter, and whatever Delia Fuentes had built after leaving behind the world that had tried to make her a liability. Marcus Webb was in Milwaukee with a wife and a son. 2 people. Still alive, still in the world, still waking up in the morning and doing whatever they did and not knowing that the woman who'd found their records was standing on a sidewalk in Chicago, letting the weight of that fact reorganize itself inside her. She pressed her face against Lucian's chest for about 3 seconds, and then straightened. "Okay," she said. "Okay," he said. She stepped back and looked at the building. "I need to go check on the second floor," she said. "I know. The contractors are doing something up there I don't entirely trust." "You want company?" She looked at him. The north-facing light caught the specific sharpness of his face, the marks that years of difficult decisions had left in the right places. The way he looked at her, the same way he'd looked at her since the first night, which she understood now was not the calculation she'd read it as, but something that didn't have a name she was willing to use yet in front of him. Though she suspected he knew what it was, and was waiting with the particular patience of a man who understood that some things required time before they could be spoken. "Yes," she said. They went inside. The contractors on the second floor were doing something that required arguing about, and she argued about it with them for 20 minutes while Lucian stood in the doorway of what would become the main training room and watched with the expression of a man who was exactly where he intended to be. The room was large, high-ceilinged, with windows on the east wall that were going to let in morning light at the kind of angle that would fall across the floor like something deliberate. She'd chosen the room for that, for the light. She walked the space while the contractors went to consult their drawings, her boots on the bare subfloor, the smell of new construction around her. She stopped in the center of the room where the morning light would land. She thought about the night she'd crashed through a window into a polished floor and the question that had come out of the dark after. Who did this to your face? She thought about the woman who'd been running through the rain. Cracked ribs, fractured trust, years of survival piled up and masquerading as a personality. She thought about how that woman had looked at a man with a gun and calculated odds and refused to go down because going down had never been in her vocabulary. She wasn't that woman anymore. Not entirely. She was something that had come from her, say something that had grown in the specific soil of the last several weeks, watered by things she couldn't have predicted and shaped by pressures she couldn't have designed. She was still standing. That was the part that mattered, still moving forward, still making things out of whatever was available. She heard Lucian come into the room behind her. He stopped a few feet back, the way he always gave her space when she was in the middle of something, and waited. She turned. He was looking at her the way he'd looked at her from the beginning, with the complete attention of a man who had decided she was worth the full cost of paying attention. No distance, no management, just her, in the center of the room, in the morning light to come. "What's wrong with the contractors?" he asked. "They're doing the ceiling anchor points wrong," she said. "You can't have the bag set up wrong, miss. The whole training program depends on the spatial layout." "Show me," he said. She showed him. They spent the next 2 hours in the building, arguing with contractors, walking the rooms, figuring out what the space could be versus what it would take to make it that thing. He asked good questions, specific ones, the kind that told her he'd actually thought about what a training facility needed rather than just financing one. She answered them. He pushed back twice, and she told him he was wrong and explained why, and he listened and said, okay, which was one of the things she'd come to find most extraordinary about him. The capacity to change position when the reasoning was sound. Without it costing him anything, it shouldn't cost him. By early afternoon, the main decisions were made. They left the building and stood on the sidewalk again with the sign above them, and the afternoon light, and the street doing its thing, and her mother had a Thursday appointment, and the preliminary indicators were positive, and 2 people whose names she'd carried in her pocket were alive in other cities with the lives they'd managed to build. And beside her was a man who had asked a question instead of pulling a trigger, who had put an empire between her and the men who wanted to make her a problem to be solved, who had financed a building and put her name on it and was going to stand in the crowd at the opening and be proud in the specific private way of a person who needed nothing from the room. She took his hand. He looked down at the hand-holding the way he looked at most things, with full attention, without performance. "You good?" he said. She looked at the sign, at her name on the building, at the street, the city, the particular quality of Chicago light in the afternoon, which was honest in the way of light that doesn't flatter but illuminates. "Getting there," she said. He squeezed her hand once. They stood on the sidewalk until a cab clipped a pothole 20 feet away and sent a sheet of standing water across the gutter, which was Chicago being Chicago, and she laughed, actually laughed, the short, real kind. And he made a sound that was close enough to the same thing. And that was it. That was the shape of the ending. Not an explosion, not a ceremony, not a final speech delivered to a room. Just 2 people on a sidewalk in front of a building that was going to become something good. One of them still carrying the weight of what it had cost to get there. Both of them present enough to know that present was the only thing that ever actually held. Behind them, the sign caught the afternoon light. Callaway Women's Defense Academy. 4 words. 1 window's worth of damage. And everything that had grown in the space between.